But I would like to set a more informal tone, so please call me Verity. I am from the United Kingdom, and I have an opportunity today to talk to you about my critical reflections around sports diplomacy. I am based at the moment at Loughborough University. That was a recent appointment. I've been at different universities, and including universities in international settings beyond the United Kingdom. So I completed a semester abroad at the University of Connecticut. So if any of you that are Huskies in the audience, I had a great time watching basketball and learning about athletics and sports in an American setting. And then more recently, after my doctoral studies, I had a great privilege to spend quite a number of months at Toyin University of Yokohama in Japan. Again, watashi wa Verity desu, yoroshiku onegaishimasu. I learned a lot about Japanese culture, including higher education. I've got a very rich, diverse, international set of collaborators, and hopefully we'll bring a bit of a flavour of that today. So although I stand up here as one person, I'm representing a number of different voices and experiences. In the next 45 minutes, and I'm going to try and leave quite a number of minutes for questions and answers, as a number of you raised some interesting questions yesterday during Daniela's presentation and keynote speech, and I'm also aware that we had quite an interesting panel yesterday on sports and diplomacy, and some of you may have questions for either myself or the next keynote speaker, Gavin Price, or indeed during our workshop, which is being led by Ivana, and will take place after the break. I'm going to focus on three key areas: interpretations of sport diplomacy, sports and diplomacy, sports diplomacy, diplomacy with sport. I could stand here and talk to you about all the different definitions, but I'm going to offer you a couple of interpretations today and how academically there is a debate and contestation about what actually constitutes sports and diplomacy. But then I'm going to move past strategy, theory, conceptualisation. I'm not quite a typical academic just yet, and I want to bring more practical examples in to understand how different people have operationalised sports diplomacy, so put it into action. And some of these examples will offer lessons about opportunities and positives and tangible ways that you can operationalise sports diplomacy, and then I will offer a couple of cautions and challenges of operationalising. And they're not necessarily negative, they are constructive reflections of what's happened in the past or in the contemporary contexts and where to next. The people sat in the audience have a fantastic opportunity in your voluntary and professional lives to do something with the term sports diplomacy, and I'd just like to contribute a few gems of understanding to your own experiences so you can take it forward. I will also be around the rest of the day. I'm wearing a Loughborough University branded t-shirt, so I will see some of you in the workshops, but if you'd like to speak further, then I will be in the cafeteria or in some of the social settings, so please come and talk to me a little bit more about this topic area. Or if you have any questions beyond the forum, my QR code links to my staff profile or LinkedIn. Again, I feel now we are part of a family or part of a community, so please reach out if you have any questions beyond what I'm going to say today. So very, very briefly, why I'm stood in front of you today is as a student at university, living in the United Kingdom, studying in the United Kingdom, who is interested in sports. The London 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games had a very strong impact on what I was curious about. I remember vividly being sat in a cafeteria in an education setting when it was announced in Singapore that London would host. I was completing my undergraduate studies as London was preparing to host and subsequently hosted the Games. And then as I took on my PhD, there was a very large public debate in the United Kingdom about what the legacy was, for what communities. Were they domestic audiences? Were they international audiences? And what was the role or inclusion of young people? So that has had a huge impact on why I've used sport, why I've used events, and why I now use the vehicle or concept of sports diplomacy to help myself understand why we continue to be involved in sport and why we often host or contribute to events. I also have a very special place in my heart for FISU and the University Federation in the UK books, because way back when I was much younger, and I must say much more glamorous back in my youth, I was very prestigiously awarded the books University Volunteer of the Year. So I not only study sport, and I'm interested in the politics of sport, but I also put it into action. So I was involved in women's football, I was involved in parasport at the University of Birmingham and the University of Nottingham, and I got involved with our sabbatical officer for sport on the university campus. And we campaigned for better equality, better accessibility, better inclusion, and we inadvertently were becoming sports diplomats. I'm still very good friends with a number of people that are connected to that picture and that award, and that again contributes to why today I'm really excited to share some of my thinking around sport and diplomacy. But enough about me. Let's go back. There's a very fashionable trend at the moment in universities, in books, in the print media, in social media, that sports diplomacy is a new phenomenon and a new term. And in my opinion, based on the evidence and insight I've gathered for nearly a decade now, that is simply not true. Richard Espy's words in the 1970s capture how for decades of modern sport, so I'm not going to take us back to the ancient Olympiads, more ancient centuries, but in the modern era of sport, so from around the 1890s onwards, people in sporting organisations, in governments and in education settings have been aware of sport and politics mixing. So to build on some of what the panel discussed yesterday about different sizes and ages of states, and to build on what Daniela was articulating around the power of sport, this is another quote to illustrate. And in a time period when FISU was also developing and growing as an organisation. So I pulled the Sophia poster from 1977, largely because I like the colours of it. It's a little bit of a Loughborough hue to the purple. But I think there's some really important messaging in here from the 1970s. And although we're in the 2020s, we are building on a practice that has been happening for over a century now. There are two large areas of sports diplomacy. One is the traditional use of sport as diplomacy. And the central actor here is the nation state. So the national government, the regional governments, the local governments, the subnational governments, who will use sport in their broader diplomatic agendas. And these are often political or foreign policy agendas. They sometimes spread into economic and trade, and more recently they have spread into development and socio-cultural foreign policy agendas. And I've put a couple of examples on this slide, again from different geographical settings and different historical periods. We've got a depiction of sports diplomacy on ice, sports in the Cold War. It's a very dominant topic area in the study of sports diplomacy, because it is so illustrative of how on the pitch and off the pitch, governments, in particular the USSR at the time and the United States of America, were utilising sport in their broader diplomatic but often combative foreign policy. However, the other two examples are a more proactive and positive use of sport as diplomacy. Rwanda, as part of their public branding and tourism strategy, have sponsored the Premier League team of the UK, Arsenal, to promote and change the perception of Rwanda and to try to increase economic input and output in terms of their tourism industry. This is driven by a government political agenda. And finally, China, who has a very large and quite different diplomatic agenda to the US or Rwanda, has used events. It's broadest form as diplomatic points of exchange or symbolism to friendship and exchange with China and its internal and external partners. And you'll notice on there that the FISU Games is featured. So that was significant for the Chinese government. And when you look back through the press releases or the imagery, there are lots of significant political figures welcoming FISU to China, describing about how the exchanges during the Games and the welcoming onto the shores of China are an important thing for the Chinese government and the Chinese populations. So this is a very traditional and conventional use of sport as diplomacy, as public diplomacy. The second major use is a flip in words. So apologies that I'm talking in my native English tongue. If I'm talking too quickly or you need me to explain some of this afterwards, please allow me to. I also have a paper that's free to access that you can read more about this on. And this is the use of diplomacy in sport. So this is how FISU becomes a diplomatic actor. This is how the International Olympic Committee thinks of itself as creating diplomatic agendas or diplomatic norms and acting on it. So this is not driven by the traditional sovereign nation state or government. And for the UK and nation branding, the UK government is not our only strong sports diplomatic partner. We also have a number of powerful private sport brands, and it's illustrated by the table behind me, which is done by a private consultancy firm that shows that the Premier League, so a private soccer league, is one of the most, if not the most, powerful and lucrative brand for the United Kingdom. Although they work in partnership with the UK government, they are a standalone, private limited company that does not necessarily have to follow the foreign policy agendas or even really what the UK government wants them to do. They are their own autonomous actor. And this has complicated the traditional space of diplomacy because power has proliferated and dissipated into different types of actors. And we heard a little bit about that yesterday in terms of human rights and also the event that has been created in Croatia as a business. It's very important, business, civic organisations, and now as significant and important in this picture of diplomacy. The final point about this table, which I found very intriguing to link us back to what we're talking about for the whole forum, is universities. So the third rated icon is British universities. So I'm very privileged that I have Loughborough on my chest. It's synonymous with sport. It's got a very powerful brand beyond the UK around sports and universities. We have Oxford, we have Cambridge, we have Durham, etc. So British universities for the UK are a very powerful icon, but that does not necessarily translate into them working with the British University College of Sports, the Books organisation, in an aligned or coherent manner. So although we have a number of powerful actors domestically, we don't necessarily all work together on a joined up way. So this use of diplomacy in sport is very much the vested interest of the partner involved. And universities, the Premier League, other sports organisations are very important to the UK. There is, of course, a combination of both, and if I had a whole day to talk to you, this is probably the slide that I would like to discuss the most, as it's not as clear-cut as sports in diplomacy and diplomacy in sport. It's not as clear-cut as just two separate debates. They often converge, they often compound, they often are at odds with each other. And again, there's just a couple of images on the slide related to the likes of Amnesty International, the United Nations and the International Olympic Committee working together around things like climate change. And more recently in Paris, we saw protests happening before the Olympic Games started to disrupt the Games. And this protest is a source and arguably another actor in diplomacy. What can academia tell us? This is what I asked myself with a group of colleagues as the pandemic hit. We had a project commission where we were going to travel, we were going to talk to people, and then as everyone in the room experienced, COVID stopped everything. started to ask more conceptual questions, and we looked at the amount of published academic papers were on the topic of sports diplomacy. And the trend is quite interesting in terms of the past 2 decades. So we did go much further back than 2000, although we know that examples exist before that, is that there was a little bit of interest. There were smatterings of debate. However, from 2012 onwards, there has been a significant rise in popularity and academics publishing on the topic of sports diplomacy. And we asked ourselves why that was. And it might be because sport has a bit more credibility. It might be because academics had a bit more freedom to study and publish on what they wanted. Or it might be because of the likes of FISU and the International Olympic Committee exerting a bit more power in the international governance system that academics began to ask, well, why is that? And I was one of them. Also, just to let you know, since we did this review, 4 years has passed, and this surge in popularity has spiked even further. So Gavin and I, Daniela to an extent, and others in the room will read some colleagues' papers who now use the term sports diplomacy for a number of different political modes, mediums and means. So it's got quite an interesting field at the moment, and as I said to you before, I represent just the tip of the iceberg. Some other key takeaways from our review is that currently, when we looked at this review, again it may have slightly changed since 2020, it is a global debate. Sports diplomacy reaches into all corners of the earth, and particular events have influenced that. So for example, the 2008 Summer Olympic and Paralympic Games in Beijing was a hot topic for a number of years. Indeed, the awarding of the Men's FIFA World Cup to Qatar in 2022, the whole bid process and corruption within FIFA attracted a lot of attention. However, although there might be different locations of research, the trend that we found, which continues to frustrate me, is that a lot of researchers looking out at sports diplomacy happening in the world are based in the West or in high-income countries. So most of the scholars are based in Europe or North America, and very little research relative to the other areas of the world is being done in South and Central America, in Sub-Saharan Africa, or indeed on Asia by scholars based in Asia. So we have a big issue in academia of looking out with our binoculars at what is happening in the world and making comments and claims without actually going and starting a community there. So I really want to stress that point because I'm very passionate about the diversity of knowledge, and I think FISU is making such a concerted effort to bring together a global community of voices to make sure that this Western bias is eradicated in different forms of power, but in my case, it's where academic knowledge comes from. I promise you there's about 2 more graphs and then I'm done with my graphs. The other interesting highlight and takeaway is that the key focus and dominant focus of the studies is on public organisations, so mostly national governments or areas which produce foreign policy. And then most dominant trend in the study of sports diplomacy is on the impacts of events, and most of those are done on the impacts and reasons for hosting the Summer Olympic Games and the FIFA Men's World Cup. Now this is fantastic because there have been a number of Olympic Games and Paralympic Games. There's been a number of FIFA Men's World Cup, and they've been hosted in a number of different contexts and caused and influenced a number of different diplomatic outcomes. However, again, a priority for me in the next period of my career, which is why I'm telling today, is that we need to branch out. The term grassroots sports diplomacy is becoming more and more popular. What does it mean for clubs? What does it mean for sports for development? What does it mean for a manager of a Premier League club? We are starting to try and diversify what the focus of academic attention is, because we can't just keep saying the same argument, because an argument and a thesis statement or a framework about the Olympic Games around knowledge and help make things a bit more practical. And that leads me to my final academic slide, no more graphs after this, and some of the dominant diplomatic outcomes. So this is not measuring the return on investment or measuring the amount of economic money that comes into hosting or doing something. This is outcomes. So what change does it make in a more meta or macro sort of view on society or the host community, or indeed the sporting community that is doing the diplomacy? And they're kind of four dominant principles or outcomes: economic, socio-cultural, sporting and political. And I'll unpack some of those in the final part of my presentation with some more illustrative case studies. But there are some implicit and explicit outcomes that sit under these. So explicitly, a number of people that harness and strategically use sports diplomacy will try and do one of the things in the cubes in orange: cross-cultural communication, mutual understanding, trust building, nation branding, increasing or changing a country's reputation, attraction, co-option, which co-option sort of underpins peace building or creating cohesion. Implicitly, there are further outcomes from sports diplomacy that are very sport specific. So for example, sport industry development, which is a key pillar of FISU. Sport tourism development, which for some of the sponsors of this week's forum, including the tourism agency, is a key outcome. Socio-economic development, which ties us back into larger international governance frameworks such as the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Now, what actors or nations or different communities try and do with sports diplomacy is achieve everything on the slide. So I'm not going to suggest using this as a template, framework or basis for an action plan. It's to go and find case studies or evidence of where sometimes trust building has worked well and how your own context, or indeed FISU's larger context, could work and adapt and adopt. In my opinion, in my research, there is not one standard framework for creating a strategy or a plan to do sports diplomacy. However, Gavin in a moment will tell you how to become a sports diplomat, which I do agree with. You can sort of have diplomatic characteristics and values. So what are some of the opportunities for operationalising? We'll get a bit more illustrative now. I've put together a couple of bullet points. This is a starter for 10 of how you can operationalise and use opportunities around sports diplomacy. The scale and visibility of sport. FISU, yourselves within the national context, have a really visible platform. You may not currently be using it effectively, but sports events and the scale of sports events is a tried and tested, workable model for gaining attention. Assets. FISU has got 75 years of history on how to do particular things well. Community build, put on events, create a global community. Again, what has worked well in different contexts, what might work well for one confederation or regional association within FISU may not work well in another one. So it's not about setting a template or a framework, it's about using the opportunity of building on successes or what has worked in different contexts and adapting. Alignments. You're all connected to the idea of using universities and the infrastructure to connect to universities and sport to create a better world. That in itself, that joint vision, that joint purpose, is a huge opportunity to then create diplomatic actions or outcomes if you have the energy and resource. And then the crossover with the university infrastructure. In the UK context, and I would argue when I visited the US and visited Japan, it is similar, comparable. Universities are often older than the sports systems, and they are seen as significant institutions within a particular place. So when you're thinking about placemaking and creating communities, universities and sport are similar in how strong they are and in the infrastructure that they already have. So are you using it effectively? Unfortunately, I don't have the answers. I'm just posing a couple of questions. In terms of the scale, FISU member associations, not quite as many as the International Olympic Committee, but nearly as close as the United Nations. So it has that global scale. Is it using it effectively? And it may be using it effectively in terms of management and governance at the moment, but have you translated this into how that works diplomatically? Within the 165 member associations, are there regional, bilateral, multilateral partnerships that could be built in the room today or beyond to achieve particular diplomatic outcomes? And one organisation that is newer, or one event that is newer, not the organisation, that has been doing this is FIFA, and Gianni Infantino, president of FIFA, is FIFA 2.0. So I've done a research project on the FIFA Women's World Cup. I've looked at all the official FIFA Women's World Cup since 1991 and how they've used diplomacy to do something. And what we noticed from 1991 until around about 1999, when the US hosted a very successful FIFA Women's World Cup, is that it didn't really seem like a diplomatic context. It didn't seem like a relevant thing for the organisation, even though the likes of North Korea were travelling to the US to play in the United States this time. But there has been a change recently due to FIFA leadership change, and that is about cascading diplomatic and strategic outcomes throughout its football infrastructure, so its football ecosystem. So this table you could put back into a FISU context. I've just used it for my own research. So FIFA has 211 member associations, 6 confederations, and then a number of different either accredited or full member associations. And for the most recent FIFA Women's World Cup in Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand, it was a cross-confederation, cross-member association event. So if FISU are thinking of ever co-hosting, you could learn a lot from this example in terms of diplomacy. But what Gianni Infantino did well, so operationalising sports diplomacy, is painted his vision, his interpretation of what it meant to women's football and the FIFA Women's World Cup in Oceania and Asia. So he has the same opinion as I do. I don't often agree with Gianni Infantino, but on this occasion I do, is that sports diplomacy is a relatively new term for a very old practice. And for the FIFA Women's World Cup, because that was the first bid during FIFA 2.0's era, is it's about working as a team, promoting equality, prioritising human rights, imperative of accountability, and it's about having the same beliefs and having strong alliances. And this played out in practice at both a federation and organising committee level, so there was an understanding and for the first time an Indigenous community committee that influenced the event. And then at a confederation level, Oceania was able to achieve a gender equality playbook, which has got specific diplomatic outcomes for the region. Now, the Asian Football Confederation did not repeat this playbook, as the Asian Football Confederation, Oceania Football Confederation are very different. And you could not take that playbook and transplant it into a different confederation setting. So again, this nuance, although sports diplomacy can be a universalising or global concept, it needs to have nuance and context-specific aspects to it. And finally, in the last couple of minutes, I just want to walk you through, as I've been walking for the past 25 minutes or so, some of the challenges of operationalising sport in and for diplomacy. And again, this is a starter for 10, and I come with props, as even the most simplest thing as a rainbow lanyard in certain country contexts can cause a diplomatic incident. So check the armband on the slide and the lanyard, which is left from university, in my hand. But challenges of operationalising sports diplomacy are basic principles of negotiation and relationship building. It is not complicated. However, it is difficult to manage and operationalise. So disagreements, managing a crisis, exploitation of sport. We've seen sport, for example, in the protests in Paris being used for negative diplomatic outcomes. The credibility of sport. Sport can sometimes be very credible, a very authentic diplomatic actor, but sometimes a multinational corporation will have far point is around resource. If you did a mapping exercise similar to what the Centre for Sport and Human Rights have done around the amount of policy, staff, resource on foreign affairs within sport organisations, it is tiny in comparison to the organising of events or the promotion of the organisation or human resource. So until the sports organisations actually see diplomacy as a credible addition to its agenda or organisation, there will also always be a resource deficit. And some of that is illustrated by someone that is very heavily connected to Loughborough, current CEO of the World Athletics, is that sport is often overstated in its potential for power and influence over the international political or the geopolitical system. So back in 2009, Lord Sebastian Coe made quite a provocative statement about why sport at the Olympics is needed in the world. Is that it appears to address seemingly intractable problems that are resistant from other orthodox approaches. Now this overstatement and overclaim has led to a number of contradictions, failed promises, rhetoric but no reality when it comes to sport and diplomacy. Sort of depicted by this plan, this strategy, which often is seen as this straight line or a set of actions, versus the messy reality of enacting and achieving diplomatic outcomes which take a long time, often way beyond the life cycle of events or the life cycle or tenure of a leader in sport. And some illustrative examples in the contemporary context rather than historical are on the board. And for time, I'm not going to go through these individually, but a few of my highlights is that one tweet, so the world of social media has been a blessing and curse for sports diplomacy. One tweet by an NBA executive supporting a protest in Hong Kong soured diplomatic relations with China-based stakeholders in basketball. It reached the global press, it reached the national governments in the US and China, and it was one tweet. On the right-hand side, we've got the hijab ban, which affected the Paris Olympics and Paralympics. I don't think it received as much media attention as it should. Go figure again on the Western bias point I made earlier. And then finally, something that's close to my heart and Loughborough's heart, and again, I practice what I preach, is the amount of single-use plastics used across the Paris Olympic Games, the Paralympics are just about to start, was very heavily criticised by athletes. They wanted to use not single-use plastics, it's more environmentally friendly, but due to sponsors of the Olympic Games at local and international levels, such as Coca-Cola, other fizzy drinks are widely available, they were not allowed to have these environmentally sustainable drinks. They had to use single-use plastics. So to wrap up, I'm going to repeat the quote that I had at the beginning, and the challenge of bringing together some of these different actors that I described and discussed throughout my presentation. I'll make these slides available, by the way, so please don't feel free like me to remember all of this. And then some key takeaways. Be curious. Think about what's important to you. Think about who is in your sphere of influence. Think about communities beyond sport, your university community, and see if you can keep building on what has come before. We can learn a lot from history and a lot from what has gone before us and have fun with it. I might be a governance politics geek and a vice chancellor focused on this, but I would like to encourage all of you to just think about whether you are indeed a sports diplomat. Thank you.
I see the hand in the back. So you can have a microphone. Yeah. Thank you. Oh, I see. I'm using it just for you. Thank you so much. But it's terrible.
Thank you. Verity, Andy from Books, so great to see that you are a volunteer of the year in 2015 and amazing to see how far you've come. I think the subject you took talk about really pertinent to us at the moment, and I was just wondering, is there any case studies or any particular piece of impact from one of the newscasts in the room today where you've seen a real, I guess, live impact on governmental inclusion with the sort of projects that the newscasts have been trying to run and how they position themselves in government? I think for us, the way our student model is funded, we really want to get into that space, and you've probably known from your research like how that happens. So just wondering if there's any case studies you've seen from around FISU that might have like considered.
Yeah, thanks Andy. And great to have people from the UK here. So in terms of our review, there was very few pieces that focused on FISU and university games, but they do exist. So after this, I'll tweet or put out a post with what those pieces were, because this data is all publicly available. And I encourage you to potentially reach out to those scholars. But there's a couple of events in the history of FISU that is covered. The other case studies based on my research, so this is not an insight into the FISU community in the slightest, is how Australia and Aotearoa New Zealand coped with the bidding cycle, preparation and enactment of the FIFA Women's World Cup is probably the most scalable, best example case study of some challenges and opportunities around sports diplomacy and in particular women inequality. There was a fallout over a Ruben sponsorship deal with Tourism Saudi Arabia. There was some cross-ocean diplomatic disagreements to do with the Pacific Islands and the use of the indigenous communities. So that's a really good, very recent example of an event of a community that is at a much smaller scale to say the mega event at the Olympics. And then finally, there are a number of programs that aren't FISU or aren't the FIFA Women's World Cup that are really successfully understanding the socio-cultural outcomes and ways that they can be part of that conversation by tapping into the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And I know that's a really simple piece of advice, Andy, but honestly, if you can, as an organisation, embed them, then that would be really useful.
Thank you so much. This is clear to you, yeah?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So maybe we have another question.
Yeah, there's a couple more.
Yeah, please.
If you want to take a couple of questions, I'll try and answer them in one medium form answer.
Thank you so much. My name is Kimi from South Africa. I've got quite a few questions, but if I may, please just ask two. In your view, how can sports diplomacy be utilized to effectively address and reconcile cultural differences between nations, particularly in the context where traditional diplomatic efforts have stalled or failed? And my second question is, considering the global nature of sports, how can we ensure that sports diplomacy initiatives are inclusive and do not inadvertently perpetuate power imbalances or cultural imperialism, particularly when involving countries with vast different levels of economic development and sporting infrastructure?
Thank you so much. That is great.
Yeah, I know. All right, you said 10 minutes questions, so we'll go into this very quickly, but maybe pick this up later in the afternoon. So first of all, fantastic questions. Some of the words used in those questions clearly show that you're on the same page as me. So for example, to address cultural differences, sport events, not necessarily sport organisations, often claim that they will guarantee respect, human rights-based rhetoric on the site in which the event is hosted. They will not reach and guarantee that a tourist or athlete that goes outside of the Olympic Village or the FIFA Women's World Cup main strip through a place would necessarily get respect, but they will always make a bold claim that on the site. And athletes, organisers, coaches are really beginning to push the boundaries of whether that's true or not. So very recently the Commonwealth Games Federation allowed people to protest at the Games, i.e. athletes. Very big change. Not sure other organisations will take that on, but interesting. And on your second question, very, very quickly, I absolutely agree with you around perpetuating really problematic things, and that's why hopefully you've sort of seen through some of my examples and talk today that I advocate for doing sports diplomacy in place-based, very specific context. I would not argue there is a universal framework, just to help us along the way, but you must take into account the cultural context, the people running it, the people involved, the beneficiaries. Otherwise, it will inevitably be short-term or fail. One more question? Yeah. And then I'll hand over to Gavin, who is talking to you more about sports diplomacy. Your lucky, lucky day.
Okay.
Okay, perfect. So from my both Swedish and international perspective, many people who work in big sports organizations or federations still today can think that sports and politics don't mix. They don't see themselves as diplomatic actors. So why do you believe many people still deny the importance of sports in global diplomacy? So why are so many people still afraid of mixing sports and politics?
Fantastic question again. My slides have gone, but the slide I had up at the end with that long list of vested interest people and communities, there it's not just people in sports organisations. Sponsors, the media do not see themselves as diplomats and think that sport is pure and does not mix with politics. And if you want to think like that, then the vehicle for diplomacy in sport to mix effectively would be through your national government, because they inherently are the political body and they will be interested in sport. So that is your vehicle to understanding how you might contribute or develop into thinking about not if you are a diplomat, but if you need to be mindful about climate change or respecting others' differences or creating economic benefits for your own organisation. If, however, and I may or may not be more on this side of the coin, think you are mixing with politics, then you are more on that second major part of the debate, which is where it's diplomacy in sport. And again, there's ways, and we're about to hear from a world-leading expert on it, on how to become diplomatic. And it's not my area of specialty, I sit more at the macro, the meso level, but that lived experience of being an athlete that thinks they've got a responsibility, or a coach, or an official, of being an ambassador or pushing a particular cause is a huge burden. And academically, we need to get better at preparing and training. So keep asking those types of questions because they're really useful. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Verity. And we have to stop because we have the second presentation of the briefing and we have to continue. And I would like to just ask you, Verity, to give a message to our students and to our teachers about the most popular side of the sports diplomacy, the people's diplomacy. Some message to our students, okay?
I probably could pick up my phone and WhatsApp about 15 different people across the world and ask them to stay next week. That is what sports diplomacy has done for me. It's created a friendship, a patchwork network of friendships and relationships in different areas of the world. And I will forever be grateful about my experiences at university and experiences in sport to afford me the skills to develop that and understand how to use and keep them going. So I hope to speak to you more about that, but please just get to know each other, build relationships, build trust, ask the types of questions that the audiences have asked about yourselves, come to our workshop. But yeah, build friendships and relationships so that you, I'm sure you already have it, could just call someone, ask a question about another side of the world, or go and stay there. Become a global community. That is how we will push the boat on things like single-use plastic, human rights, and other really thorny, intractable problems.
Thank you so much.